There is something that most people never think about when they imagine surviving a brutal winter on the northern plains. They think about firewood, they think about wool blankets and iron stoves and whether the walls are thick enough to hold through the night. They think about splitting wood before the first hard freeze, about stacking it high and tight against the side of the house, about the sound a good fire makes when it catches and holds. But here is what they'd never think about. And this is the thing that killed people by the hundreds in the Northern Territories during the winter of 1886. They never think about the ground beneath their feet. They never think about what the earth itself can do when a human being is wise enough or desperate enough to ask it for help. This is the story of a woman who asked and the earth answered. But before we begin at the beginning, let me show you where this story ends up. Because if you don't see where it's going, you might not believe how it gets there. Picture an underground chamber 8 feet below the surface of the frozen prairie. It is January. The temperature above ground has held at 38 degrees below zero for 60 straight hours. The wind is measured at 47 miles per hour. Cottonwood trees are splitting from the cold. A man has been found frozen solid on the road between Grafton and Forest River, 2 miles short of where he was trying to go. And in that chamber, 8 feet down, 16 people are breathing. 16 people are warm. An oil lantern is burning and its flame is steady, and it does not flicker. Not once, not even when the worst of it comes. The woman who built that chamber dug it with her own hands. She was 31 years old when she started. She was a widow. She had 2 daughters and a milk cow and $62 of debt. And every single neighbor she had told her she should leave. She did not leave. She dug. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Her name was Josephine Caldwell. Most people called her Josie, though she never invited them to. In the autumn of 1884, she was 31 years old alone and in possession of exactly 47 acres of unbroken prairie in the northeastern corner of Dakota Territory, roughly 11 miles southwest of the small settlement of Grafton. She had no husband. She had no sons old enough to work. She had 2 daughters. Audrey was 9 sharp-eyed and quiet in the way of children who have already learned that watching is more useful than talking. Phoebe was 7, soft-hearted, easily startled, the kind of child who felt the temperature of a room before she noticed anything else in it. She had a milk cow named Bess. She had 3 laying hens that had already begun to slow their production with the shortening of the days. And she had a debt of $62 owed to the dry goods merchant in town, a man named Fenton, who had extended her credit through the summer, with the patience of someone who had already begun calculating what her land might be worth when she failed to repay him. The land itself was a good land. That was not the problem. The problem was that Josie had arrived at it through grief. Her husband, Samuel Caldwell, had died of a ruptured appendix in the spring of 1883, 2 days after the pain began and 1 day after it became clear that no doctor could reach them in time. He was 34 years old. He had been, by every account from the neighbors who would later speak of him with the soft reverence reserved for the recently dead, a capable man. He had built their house himself, a 1-room sod structure with a wood plank floor and a single south-facing window that let in just enough light to read by on clear afternoons. He had dug the well. He had broken 16 acres of sod in their first 2 seasons. On the last night Samuel was conscious, he did not say anything that a person might call a final word. He did not tell Josie he loved her. He did not ask her to promise anything. What he said, with the focused clarity of a man whose body was failing, but whose mind had not yet followed, was this: the cross beam on the woodshed roof. I didn't finish it. Josie nodded. That was how they had always spoken to each other, in the language of things left to do. And in that language, a broken cross beam and an unfinished roof were as close to "I love you" as either of them had ever needed to get. Audrey stood in the corner of the room. She was 7 years old then, and she watched her mother wipe her father's face for the last time with a damp cloth, and she did not cry, but she did not look away either. Phoebe, who was 5, slept through the night on the other side of the bed and did not know until morning that her father was gone. After the funeral, which only Warren and Helen Garfield attended because the other neighbors were too far and the weather had turned, Josie stood at the edge of her husband's grave and realized something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. No one cried except her and Audrey. Not because people were cruel, but because on the northern plains, death was too common a thing for anyone to stop for very long. And then Samuel was gone and Josie was left with all of it. The acres, the debt, the daughters, and the unfinished work that stretches out in front of a widow on the northern plains like a road that simply does not end. The neighbors, such as they were, did not expect her to stay. Warren Garfield held a claim a mile and a half to the east. He was not an unkind man. He came to see Josie in September of 1884, standing at the edge of her yard with his hat in his hands, and he said the difficult thing he genuinely believed, without cruelty, but without hesitation either. "There's no shame in it," he told her. "A woman alone with 2 children this far out with what's coming. There's no shame in going back to Minnesota where your sister lives." Josie thanked him for his concern. She did not go. But Warren Garfield was not the only one who believed Josie Caldwell was making a mistake. In August of 1884, a man named Reverend Cyrus Palmer came to visit. He was the closest thing to a spiritual authority within riding distance. A thin-voiced man with clean fingernails and the particular confidence of someone who had never once doubted that he understood God's intentions better than the people he was advising. He came twice. The first time he brought a loaf of bread and a gentle suggestion. "The Lord does not want children to suffer for the stubbornness of their parents," he said, sitting at her kitchen table with his hands folded, as if he were about to pray, which he might have been. The second time he brought a letter. He had written it himself, addressed to Josie's sister in Minnesota, informing her that Josephine Caldwell was in need of assistance and that the situation on the homestead was, in his judgment, untenable for a woman alone with young children. He had not asked Josie's permission. He had not mentioned the letter before writing it. He presented it to her as a fait accompli, as a kindness already done, and he seemed genuinely surprised when Josie read the letter, folded it carefully, handed it back to him, and said in a voice that was perfectly level, "You wrote about me to someone else without asking me. Please do not do that again." Palmer left. He walked to his horse with the expression of a man who is certain he is right and who needs only time to prove it. But that night after the girls were asleep, Josie lay in the dark and thought about what Palmer had said. Not the part about children suffering for the stubbornness of their parents. She looked at Audrey and Phoebe sleeping on the narrow bed, their breathing slow and even. And she asked herself a question she had been avoiding since Samuel died. If she failed, who would pay the price, her or them? She did not find the answer that night. She lay awake until the window turned gray with dawn, and the question sat on her chest like a stone. But she found it the next morning. She found it when Audrey, who was 9 years old and stood no taller than the handle of a spade, came through the door at first light, carrying a cup of warm milk. Audrey had gone out to the barn alone in the cold without being asked, and milked best by herself. She set the cup on the table in front of her mother and said simply, "I can do it now, Mama." Josie looked at her daughter. She looked at the cup of milk, and she thought, "They are not fragile, and neither am I." What none of the neighbors knew, not Warren Garfield, not Reverend Palmer, not the merchant, Fenton with his careful ledger of debts, was that Josephine Caldwell was not simply an immigrant widow with too much stubbornness and too little sense. She was the daughter of a man named Willard Nesheim. Willard Nesheim had spent 40 years building things in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of central Norway before emigrating to America in 1871. He was a carpenter by trade, but a builder by nature. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a man who follows plans and a man who understands why the plans work. As a young apprentice, Willard had trained under a master builder named Olav Gresseth, and from Gresseth he had learned a technique so old and so practical that it had simply been forgotten by the people who no longer needed it. Willard had built root cellars, but not the shallow afterthought kind that every farmer digs for his turnips. He had built deep living cellar structures designed not just to store vegetables, but to sustain human life in conditions that would kill a man in an open room above ground. The principle was simple and it was ancient, and it was this: the earth below the frost line at a depth of roughly 6 to 8 feet maintains a temperature between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the air above it is doing. In a northern winter, when the surface temperature drops to 30 or 40 below zero, the ground 8 feet down remains warm enough to keep a person alive without any fire at all. The difference between the frozen surface and the living earth below it is not a matter of comfort. It is the difference between dying and surviving. Willard Nesheim had built 3 such structures during his life in Norway, and he had taught his daughter everything. The last time Josie saw her father alive was in the summer of 1880 at the kitchen table of their farmhouse outside St. Paul. Willard was 61 years old and still strong, but beginning to move with the deliberate care of a man who has stopped taking his body for granted. He sat across from Josie and drew the cross-section of the underground chamber on a folded sheet of brown paper, the way an engineer might draw a bridge with measurements and notes and small arrows indicating the direction of airflow. The main chamber was to be 8 feet deep from surface, grade 10 feet long, and 7 feet wide. The walls were to be vertical, cut cleanly into the subsoil. The ceiling was to be formed by laying round timbers across the full width of the chamber, then covering those timbers with 12 inches of loose straw, then 18 inches of tamped earth. The floor was to be left as bare packed earth so that the thermal mass of the ground itself could radiate upward into the space. One ventilation shaft 4 inches in diameter, angled at 45 degrees from the ceiling to the surface, positioned so that the prevailing wind would draw stale air out of the chamber through the Venturi effect rather than forcing cold air in. One entrance, a trap door in the floor of whatever structure sat above it, framed with planks fitted with leather hinges and covered when closed with dirt and debris so that it would be invisible. Josie asked him a question that day that she would think about for years afterward. "Why don't you build one here, Papa, here in Minnesota?" Willard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because here nobody believes they need one. People only build these when they are about to die, or when they are smart enough to know that winter is coming before it arrives." He handed her the brown paper drawings and said one more thing. "Don't explain it to anyone. Build it first. Winter will speak for you better than you ever could." He folded his hands on the table then, and Josie noticed that his knuckles were swollen at the joints, the hands of a man who had spent 4 decades working with wood and stone and frozen earth. She noticed, too, that he looked at the drawings the way some men look at photographs of their children, with a mixture of pride and worry, pride in what they had made and worry about what would happen to it when they were gone. She understood, though she did not say so, that her father was not simply giving her a set of plans. He was giving her an inheritance, not money or land or anything that could be recorded in a courthouse ledger, but something more durable than any of those things. He was giving her the knowledge of how to survive, which is the only inheritance that cannot be taken away. 2 years later, in the autumn of 1882, Willard Nesheim died. Josie kept the drawings in a tin box under her bed. In the 18 months after Samuel died, she read them more than 20 times. She did not read them the way a person reads a letter from someone they miss. She read them the way a person reads a blueprint, because that is exactly what they were. In the first week of October 1884, Josephine Caldwell began to dig. She chose her location with the precision of someone who had been planning since spring. Not in the open yard, not in front of the house, directly beneath the footprint of the existing woodshed. The woodshed was a simple, lean-to structure 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, built against the north wall of the sod house. It had a dirt floor and a roof of rough-cut planks covered in tar paper, and it already held most of her winter's wood supply, approximately 3.5 cords of cottonwood and green ash that Audrey and Phoebe had helped her stack through September. The woodshed was invisible from the road. It faced north, which meant no passing traveler would see anything unusual. It was in every respect the most forgettable structure on the claim. That was precisely why she chose it. She began by pulling the wood stacks away from the north corner of the shed, moving them carefully so the outer appearance would not change. Then she started digging. The topsoil in that part of Dakota Territory runs between 18 and 24 inches deep, a rich dark loam, before giving way to dense pale subsoil of clay and fine gravel. She worked with a long-handled spade and a short-handled trenching shovel, and she moved the excavated earth in a wheelbarrow 63 loads. In the first 3 days, piling it against the south side of the sod house, where it would look like nothing more than a woman banking her walls against the coming cold. Which in a sense it was. She dug every morning from first light until the girls needed her for the midday meal, and again in the late afternoon until the light failed. Her hands blistered and the blisters broke, and she kept digging. On the third day, the blade of her long-handled spade hit a layer of rock at 3 feet and snapped clean at the neck. Josie sat down at the bottom of the unfinished hole. Her hands were raw and cracked. She had no spare spade. She had no money to buy one. The rock under her knees was pale and hard, and it looked in the failing afternoon light like the kind of obstacle that was not going to move. And she cried, not because of the pain in her hands, not because of the broken tool. She cried because, for the first time since Samuel died, the thought entered her mind, fully formed and undeniable. Maybe everyone is right. Maybe I cannot do this. She sat there until the light was gone. Then she climbed out, cooked supper for the girls, put them to bed, and sat at the kitchen table with her father's papers. She did not open the drawings. She opened the letter, the last one Willard had written her, autumn of 1882, 3 months before he died. She had read it many times, but she had never noticed a particular passage near the end. It said, every cellar I ever built, I wanted to quit at least once. The first one I wanted to quit 3 times. Rock is not the enemy. Rock is the earth telling you that you have reached the right place, the place that is hard enough to hold. Josie read that sentence twice. Then she closed the letter and went to bed. In the morning, she spent 2 hours sharpening the remaining spade on the grinding stone behind the barn. When she went back down into the hole and struck the rock layer again, it turned out to be 6 inches thick. On the other side of it was clean, dense clay, perfect for cutting. It was during the digging that Audrey found out. Josie had been careful, working only when Phoebe was occupied and Audrey was managing the hens or hauling water. But Audrey was 9 years old and observant in the way of a child who has learned that adults do not always explain what matters most. On the 5th morning, Audrey walked into the woodshed and found her mother standing waist-deep in a hole in the ground, covered in pale clay, breathing hard. "Mama, are you digging a grave?" The question stopped Josie like a hand on her chest, because of course that was what Audrey would think. Audrey had seen exactly one hole dug in the ground in her life, and it was the one they put her father in. A deep hole was a grave. There was no other reference point. Josie climbed out of the hole and knelt in front of her daughter. She could not tell Audrey everything. She could not explain the full design because she did not want anyone to know, and a 9-year-old cannot be expected to carry a secret that large without it spilling. But she would not lie. "I'm building a room," she said. "A room that Grandpa Willard taught me how to build. It goes underground, and it will keep us warm when the winter gets bad." Audrey looked at the hole. She looked at her mother's hands. She looked at the clay streaked across Josie's face. And then she said, "Can I help?" From that day on, Audrey hauled the wheelbarrow loads of excavated earth while Josie dug. They did not discuss it further. Phoebe was not told. Josie reached the required depth of 8 feet on the 9th day. She had moved in total approximately 4.5 tons of earth. Her lower back ached in a way she could feel in her teeth when she turned over at night. The timber for the ceiling was the most significant challenge. There were no 6-inch round timbers on the open prairie of northeastern Dakota Territory in 1884. What there was, if a person knew where to find it, was a stand of mature cottonwood trees along a small creek that ran through the Garfield claim to the east. Warren Garfield had told Josie in the spring that she was welcome to cut deadfall from that stand, and she had thanked him at the time without knowing precisely how she would use the permission. She cut 7 cottonwood poles each, roughly 8 feet long, and between 5 and 7 inches in diameter, on a cold morning in the 2nd week of October. She hauled them on a sled using Bess the cow, 2 poles per trip, 4 trips in 2 days, each round trip covering approximately 3 miles. On the 3rd trip, Bess slipped on the frozen creek bank and nearly went down. Josie had to unhitch the sled, lead the cow to safe ground, go back, drag the poles by hand across the slick section, then rehitch on the other side. It cost her 2 hours. That night, her back hurt badly enough that she slept face down on the floor because she could not lie on her back. It was on the fourth trip that she met Harriet Solberg for the first time. Harriet was about 60, a widow herself living alone on a claim 2 miles to the south. She was walking along the track with a bundle of dry brush on her back, and she stopped to watch Josie hauling cottonwood poles behind a milk cow. She did not ask why. She did not ask what the poles were for. She looked at the arrangement, the cow straining against the makeshift harness, the heavy poles dragging ruts in the frozen ground, and she said, "That cow won't give decent milk for 3 days after you work her like that." Josie said, "I know." Harriet nodded the way a person nods when they have just heard the only correct answer to a question. From that point on, and the two women began a quiet exchange. Harriet lent Josie a heavy needle for mending harness leather. Josie brought Harriet eggs. Neither of them called it friendship, but it was the closest thing either of them had out there. Josie laid the 7 cottonwood poles across the width of the chamber on October 14th, setting them into notches cut into the subsoil walls so that each pole rested flush and could not shift. She packed the gaps with strips of burlap soaked in water and allowed to freeze solid, a technique her father had called frost mortar. Over the poles, she laid straw 14 inches deep. Over the straw, she replaced the excavated earth, tamping each layer with the flat back of her spade and the heel of her boot. When she finished, the surface of the woodshed floor was elevated by approximately 8 inches, barely noticeable. She spread wood chips over the disturbed area and restacked the firewood on top. She framed the trap door on October 17th. The lumber was 2 by 6 inch planks she had purchased in Grafton in August, telling Fenton they were for repairing the house floor, a purchase that raised no comment because it was exactly the kind of thing a widow with a deteriorating homestead might reasonably buy. The door itself was 2 pieces face nailed together with a recessed pull ring made from a bent nail and a short length of harness leather. When closed and covered with its scattering of dirt and wood chips, it was completely invisible. She tested it 6 times before she was satisfied. On the 5th test, she had Audrey climb down alone to see whether a 9-year-old could enter the chamber without help if Josie was not there. Audrey went down into the dark. She stood at the bottom and called up, "Mama, it's warm down here." Then she was quiet for a moment. "But it's too dark." Josie tossed down the matchbox. "Can you light the candle by yourself?" Audrey struck the match. The candle caught. Light rose in the chamber, and Audrey looked around at the walls her mother had cut at the timber ceiling at the earth floor that was radiating a warmth she could feel through the soles of her shoes. And she said something Josie did not expect. "Grandpa would have liked this place." That was the moment Josie knew. Whatever happened next, whatever the winter brought, she had already passed on the thing that mattered most. Not the drawings, not the measurements, the way of seeing the ground. The ventilation shaft she bored on October 19th using a long-handled auger borrowed from Warren Garfield. She told him she needed it to bore drainage holes through the base of her water trough, which was true, and which she did in fact do before returning it. The shaft ran at 45 degrees through the north wall of the woodshed, emerging outside 6 inches above ground level with its opening angled slightly downward. Before sealing the trap door for the first time, Josie stored inside the chamber everything she calculated they would need: 40 pounds of dried beans, 30 pounds of cornmeal, a 10-pound slab of salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, 12 quarts of preserved vegetables in sealed glass jars, a 5-gallon tin of lard, 2 wool blankets, a change of heavy clothing, for each of them a box of matches, 4 candles, the small oil lantern, with 2 full pints of lamp oil, the hand-copied drawings her father had made his last letter, and one thing more, a small folding knife that Samuel had used for sharpening pencils. It was the only possession of his that she had kept, not for its value, but because the handle fit her hand. Josie told no one what she had built. Not Warren Garfield, not the merchant Fenton, not Harriet Solberg, not yet. She understood with the particular clarity that comes from having watched people dismiss her father's ideas throughout his life, that the surest way to undermine a thing that works is to explain it to someone who has not yet seen it work. But Audrey knew, and Audrey, who was practical but also 9 years old, and had not yet learned the full weight of what secrets cost, asked a question one evening that Josie had not anticipated. Why can't we tell Mr. Garfield he's nice? Josie set down the sock she was darning and looked at her daughter. Because if he doesn't believe me, he'll tell other people I've lost my mind. And if he does believe me, he'll want me to build one for him before winter, and I don't have time for that. Audrey thought about this for a long moment. Then she said, but what if he needs help? What if winter comes and he can't keep warm? Then winter will come, Josie said, and I will help him. Audrey was not finished. But what if he dies before he gets to our house? Josie did not answer. She picked up the sock and went back to darning. But the question stayed with her, and it would stay with her for 2 full years, pressing on her like a bruise she could not see. In late October, Josie went into Grafton to pay down $14 of her debt and buy a second pair of wool stockings for Phoebe. At the counter, Fenton looked at her over his ledger and said in the tone of a man mentioning something of no particular importance, that offer on your land is still open if you've changed your mind. Josie asked what offer. Fenton adjusted his glasses. Someone inquired about available parcels in your area, he said. I mentioned you might be amenable. Josie paid her $14. She bought the stockings. She walked out without responding to the offer. But on the road home, as the wind picked up and the first real cold of the season pressed against her face, she thought about what Fenton had said. Someone was asking about her land. Someone who knew she was in debt. Someone who was already calculating the odds that she would not make it through the winter. She was not only fighting the cold, she was fighting people who were betting on her to lose. That night, after Audrey and Phoebe were asleep, Josie lifted the trap door in the woodshed floor and climbed down into the chamber alone. She did not light the lantern. She sat on the bare earth floor in the dark and placed both hands flat on the ground. The warmth came up through her palms, steady, patient, unchanging. She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table drawing arrows on brown paper. She thought about Samuel and the crossbeam he never finished. She thought about Audrey asking, are you digging a grave? And she realized that the answer, in some way she had not understood until this moment, was yes. She was burying her fear 8 feet deep, below the frost line, where it could not reach her children. She climbed out. She closed the trap door. She covered it with dirt and wood chips until it disappeared. And she went to bed and she slept well. The best she had slept since Samuel died, because the earth beneath the woodshed was warm, and she had built something that no one could see, and it was finished, and it was hers. And winter was coming, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of it. The first time Josephine Caldwell brought her daughters underground to survive, it was not because of courage. It was because the thermometer nailed to the inside wall of their sod house read 38 degrees at 10 in the morning, and the stove was eating wood at a rate that would leave them with nothing by nightfall. That was late December 1884. A blizzard had come in from the northwest 3 days earlier, the kind that does not announce itself with a gradual drop in temperature, but arrives all at once like a door slamming. By the second morning, the air outside was 28 degrees below zero, and the wind was driving snow horizontally across the open ground with enough force to sting exposed skin in under a minute. Josie had kept them in the sod house for the first day, feeding the stove, carefully counting sticks, the way a person counts coins when they are not sure how many they have left. She had done the arithmetic twice. The wood pile in the shed would last another 30 hours at the current rate of burning. But the stove was not holding the room. The cold was coming through the sod walls, through the plank floor, through the single south-facing window that Samuel had set with such care and that now admitted a thin blade of frozen air along its lower frame. By the second morning, when she could see her breath inside the house and Phoebe was shivering under both blankets, Josie made the decision without ceremony. She told Audrey to dress in her heaviest wool. She wrapped Phoebe in a blanket and carried her to the door. She tied a rope from the house door to the woodshed door, 12 feet of open ground, that the blizzard had turned into something that might as well have been a mile, and she led them across it in under a minute, holding the rope with one hand and Phoebe against her chest with the other. She opened the trap door. She lowered Audrey first, then Phoebe. Then she climbed down herself, pulled the door shut, and seated the locking bar across its underside. The air in the chamber wrapped around them. Not warm the way a fire is warm, not with heat coming from a single source, but warm the way the inside of a living thing is warm evenly from every direction, from the floor and the walls and the earth itself. Josie lit the lantern and hung it from a bent nail in one of the ceiling timbers. Phoebe was shaking, though whether from cold or fear, Josie could not tell. She sat against the stone wall with the wool blanket across her shoulders and pulled her younger daughter into her lap. Phoebe cried. She cried the way a 7-year-old cries when the world has become too strange to process, not with anger, but with a kind of bewildered sorrow, the sorrow of a child who does not understand why she is in a hole in the ground instead of in her bed. Josie held her and did not try to explain. She did not say, "It will be all right," because that is what adults say when they want a child to stop crying, and Josie did not want Phoebe to stop. She wanted Phoebe to finish. Phoebe finished after about 40 minutes. Then she lay down on the earth floor, still sniffling, and the warmth of the ground came up through the blanket and into her small body, and she closed her eyes. She slept for 11 hours without waking once. Audrey did not sleep for a long time. She sat across from her mother in the lantern light, looking at the walls, the ceiling, timbers, the packed earth above them, the faint movement of air near the ventilation shaft. She was processing. She was measuring what she saw against what she knew, and what she knew was that her mother had built this place in 9 days and had told almost no one. When she finally spoke, it was well past midnight. The blizzard above them was a muffled roar, distant and irrelevant, like a conversation in another room. "Mama, if you die like Papa did, who will know about this place?" Josie looked at her daughter across 8 feet of underground space, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Something that was not fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. The recognition that Audrey was asking the right question at exactly the right time. "You will," Josie said. "I'm going to teach you everything." She began that night, not with the drawings, though those would come later. She began with the things that could be learned by hand. She showed Audrey how to wet a finger and hold it up near the ventilation shaft to feel the direction of the airflow. She taught her to count breaths in the enclosed space slowly to develop a sense of how the air was moving and whether it was sufficient. She showed her how the stones along the western wall were stacked with their flattest faces outward, and she let Audrey press her palm against them and feel the warmth stored inside. Then she taught her something that was not in the drawings at all. She taught her how to listen to the chamber. The sound of the ventilation shaft when the wind above was strong had a low, steady whistle to it, barely audible but distinct. When the whistle was present, the system was drawing properly. When it went silent, it meant either the wind had died or the shaft was blocked, and either way it needed attention. Audrey listened. She closed her eyes and tilted her head and focused until she could separate the shaft whistle from the sound of her own breathing and her sister's breathing and the muffled noise of the storm. She found it. She opened her eyes and nodded. Josie also taught her how to test the trapdoor seal from inside. If the locking bar was properly seated, no cold air would enter from above. But if the bar shifted, or if the wood warped from moisture, a thin line of cold could creep in along the frame. Josie showed Audrey how to run her fingertips along the edges of the trapdoor in the dark, feeling for any change in temperature that would indicate a gap. It was the kind of knowledge that could not be written on brown paper, the kind that lived in the nerve endings of a person's hands and could only be passed from one set of hands to another. Audrey learned the way her grandfather had learned, and the way Josie herself had learned, not from books but from contact, from the direct conversation between a human hand and the material it is working with. They stayed in the chamber for 3 days. They ate cornmeal and dried beans. They slept on the warm ground. When the blizzard broke on the afternoon of the 3rd day, Josie climbed out into the woodshed, pushed the outer door open against the packed snow, and walked to the house to check the damage. The stove was cold. The water bucket had frozen solid. A new crack had appeared in the lower corner of the window glass. None of it mattered. The second time she used the chamber that first winter was in late January, when a chest cold settled into Josie's lungs with enough weight that breathing became a conscious effort. She needed continuous warmth. She could not maintain it in the sod house without burning through her remaining wood at a pace that would leave them exposed in February. So she moved herself and the girls underground for 4 days, and the steady warmth of the chamber did what no amount of firewood could have done. It held her at a temperature where her body could fight without having to fight the cold at the same time. By the spring of 1885, Josie Caldwell was the only homesteader within a 6-mile radius who had not lost a single animal to the winter. Warren Garfield had lost 2 pigs and a calf. Silas Drummond, the Norwegian bachelor, 3 miles to the northwest, had lost 7 of his 8 sheep when a sudden temperature drop in February caught him without bedding straw, and his barn roof partially collapsed under snow load. The Whitmore family, who had arrived from Wisconsin the previous spring and built a small frame house with walls only 4 inches thick, had spent the last 6 weeks of winter living with the Garfields after their stove cracked, and they burned through their remaining firewood trying to compensate. The elderly Brewsters, a couple in their late 60s who held a claim 3 miles to the northeast, had barely been heard from all winter. Their adult son had taken work in Fargo the previous autumn and had not returned, and the old couple had gone quiet in the way that isolated people go quiet when they are using all of their remaining energy simply to survive until the thaw. None of them knew about the chamber. None of them thought to ask how Josie had managed so well. What they decided, and this is the thing that people decide when they cannot explain a woman's competence, was that she had been lucky. Warren Garfield said as much to his wife Helen, and Helen repeated it to the Whitmore woman, who mentioned it to Josie one afternoon in April with the tone of friendly informing that is a community's way of letting you know what it has decided about you. Josie had been lucky. The winter had not been so bad, really. She had managed. It was good that she had managed. The general sense was that this had been a special circumstance, and that the next winter or the one after would demonstrate that a woman alone on 47 acres was not a sustainable arrangement. They were kind about it. That almost made it worse. In April of 1885, something happened that Josie did not learn about until Harriet Solberg walked 2 miles through spring mud to tell her. Reverend Cyrus Palmer had organized a meeting at the Garfield house. Not a formal gathering, nothing with minutes or an agenda, just neighbors talking. The subject of the conversation was the situation of Josephine Caldwell. Palmer had proposed in his careful way that the community ought to help Josie sell her land and relocate for the good of the children. It was framed as concern. It was presented as charity. But underneath the concern and the charity was a presumption that Josie recognized instantly when Harriet described it to her, the presumption that a woman who had survived was still somehow in need of rescue. Warren Garfield had been at that meeting. He had not spoken against the proposal. He had not spoken for it either. He had simply been present, and his presence without objection was a form of agreement, and everyone in the room understood that. Harriet told Josie this without softening it. She sat at Josie's kitchen table with a cup of chicory coffee that was more hot water than anything else, and she said, "They don't hate you. They just can't imagine you succeeding. Because if you succeed, then everything they believe about how the world works is wrong." Josie was not angry. She had expected something like this, though she had not expected it to be organized, not expected it to have the structure of a meeting rather than the drift of gossip. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." Harriet looked at her for a long time. There was something in the old woman's expression that Josie had not seen from anyone else on the plains, a quality of recognition, as if Harriet were seeing clearly for the first time something she had only guessed at before. In the summer of 1885, Josie expanded the chamber. She dug a secondary alcove off the eastern wall 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, connected to the main space by a low arched opening that required an adult to duck to pass through. She fitted this alcove as a stable annex with a low wooden manger against the far wall and the floor covered in 6 inches of clean sand over the bare earth. The 3 hens could be lowered in a hinged crate through a second smaller trapdoor. She cut directly above the alcove. She added a second ventilation shaft mirroring the first. Her father's notes had described how the original builders in Norway had routinely housed small livestock underground during extreme cold. The animals provided additional body heat that could raise the temperature of the enclosed space significantly. Bess the cow was too large, but the hens were not. She also added that summer a feature Willard had described, but which she had not built in the initial construction. Along the western wall of the main chamber, she stacked 47 river stones, each weighing between 8 and 20 pounds, collected over 3 separate wagon trips to the creek on the Garfield claim. She arranged them in an interlocking pattern, building a mass roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet deep. She tested it on a cold October morning. She heated the chamber with the lantern for 2 hours, then extinguished it and sealed the trapdoor. When she returned 12 hours later, the space was still warm. Outside, the temperature was 14 degrees above zero and dropping. She went back to the house and started cooking supper. Audrey, now 10, had helped carry stones. On one trip, she slipped on the creek bank and dropped a 15-pound stone on her own ankle. It did not break, but it swelled badly enough that she limped for 3 days. She did not cry. She said, "I'll carry the smaller ones." Josie looked at her daughter and saw Samuel. Not the face, the response. Note the problem. Adjust. Continue. The summer of 1886 was dry and unusually warm across the northern plains. The range cattle were in poor condition from overstocking and sparse grass. Josie noticed things that the squirrels were caching more aggressively than usual, that the muskrats along the creek had built their lodges unusually thick and high, that the early migrating birds had left 2 full weeks ahead of schedule. She noticed that the ground froze hard in the first week of November, 3 weeks earlier than the year before. She noticed that the first snowfall, which came on the 13th, left a crust that did not melt and did not soften. She began making preparations. She moved additional provisions into the chamber. She refilled the lamp oil tin to capacity. She brought in a 48 stone, a flat piece of dark shale that she wedged into the top of the wall. She re-examined every joint in the ceiling, timbers, replacing 2 sections of mortar that had cracked over the summer with fresh packed clay. She moved the hen's crate into the alcove permanently. In the middle of October 1886, a man named Franklin Thorne arrived in Grafton from Fargo. He wore a good coat and leather shoes, and he spent a long time in Fenton's store talking to the merchant in a voice too low for the other customers to hear. A week later, he appeared at Josie's door. He was polite. He was professional. He introduced himself as a land agent representing interests in Fargo, and he came directly to the point. He wanted to buy her 47 acres at $3.50 per acre. That was roughly $165. Enough to pay off the remaining debt to Fenton, buy train tickets to Minnesota, and have a small amount left over. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, standing on her doorstep with his hat in his hands, in a posture that deliberately echoed the way decent men present themselves to widows. "I am not a bad man. I am offering you a way out before winter closes every door." Josie looked at him. She looked at his clean shoes, which were wrong for this country, and which told her that he had not come to farm. She said, "Who told you about my land?" Thorne smiled. "Good land speaks for itself," he said. Josie knew he was lying. She had been lied to enough times in her life to recognize it not by any particular sign, but by the absence of one, the absence of the small hesitation that truthful people carry when they are saying something that might not be received well. "My land is not for sale," she said. Thorne nodded. He placed a business card on her table. "I'll be in Grafton through the end of November," he said, "if you change your mind." After he left, Audrey, who had been sitting in the corner pretending to darn a sock, said, "Mama, should we sell?" Josie looked at her daughter. This child who could read her grandfather's drawings, who had hauled stones and milked a cow in the dark and climbed into an underground chamber alone at the age of 9. "Do you want to sell?" Josie asked. Audrey shook her head. "Then we don't." Later from Harriet, Josie learned the rest of it. Thorne had spoken with Reverend Palmer before coming to see her. Palmer had confirmed with the particular authority of a man who considers his judgment divinely informed that Josephine Caldwell would not survive another winter. Fenton had shown Thorne his ledger, the one with Josie's outstanding balance marked in red ink. 3 men, None of them working together exactly, but all of them standing to gain from the same outcome. Fenton gets his debt repaid. Palmer gets to be proven right. Thorne gets 47 acres of good land at a price that would make him smile all the way back to Fargo. Josie stood in her kitchen and looked at the door Thorne had walked out of. She was not frightened. She was not angry. She was doing arithmetic. She had the chamber. She had provisions. She had the stone wall and the ventilation and the trap door that nobody knew about. The winter could come. She was ready for the winter. But she was also tired. That was the thing she did not let anyone see. Not Audrey, not Harriet, not the man in the good coat who had come to buy her failure. She was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle and bone. She was tired of being the only person who believed in what she was doing. She was tired of carrying the knowledge alone, of living in a community that saw her survival as an anomaly rather than an achievement, of knowing that the very people who would benefit most from what she had built were the ones most certain she should leave. That evening, after the girls were in bed, Josie went to the woodshed alone. She did not open the trap door. She simply stood on top of it on the wooden floor that concealed everything she had made, and she pressed the sole of her boot against the planks and felt the faint warmth rising from below. It was still there. It would still be there in January and in February and in every winter that followed. She had built something that did not depend on her mood or her energy or her willingness to keep going. She had built something that worked whether she was tired or not. She went back to the house and slept. But the winter was not the only thing she had to survive. The first serious storm of the season came on November 17th, 1886. 3 days of temperatures that never rose above 15 below zero, with winds steady out of the northwest between 25 and 35 miles per hour. Josie kept herself and the girls in the sod house for the first day, feeding the stove carefully and monitoring the wood supply with the practiced arithmetic of a woman who has learned to count every stick. On the second day, when the stove could no longer hold the room and the wood was disappearing at a rate she could not sustain, she made the decision the same way she had made it 2 years before, without drama, with precision. She told the girls to dress. She tied the rope. She led them across. She lowered them down. She pulled the trap door shut and locked it from the inside. The chamber received them the way it always did. Josie touched the stone wall and felt its stored warmth against her palm, steady and patient, and she knew without checking any instrument that the space was ready. She lit the lantern. She hung it. Phoebe settled against her mother's side. Phoebe did not cry this time. She was 2 years older now, and she had learned something that most adults never learn, that the feeling of safety does not always come from a familiar place. Sometimes it comes from a strange one. "Mama, are we going to be all right?" Josie said yes. Not the way people say it when they are hoping, the way people say it when they know. Within 2 hours, the space was warm enough that Josie extinguished the lantern to conserve oil. They sat in the dark and listened to the storm above them, a sound so distant it might have been a memory. By morning, with no heat source other than the stone wall and the warmth of their 3 bodies, the chamber was still comfortable. Josie relit the lantern for 2 hours, then extinguished it again. The storm continued for another 31 hours. They ate, they slept, they told stories about Willard Nesheim, and Audrey practiced sketching the shaft angles from memory on the back of the cornmeal sack, and Phoebe fell asleep with her head on her sister's shoulder. When the storm broke on the afternoon of the 3rd day, Josie climbed out into the woodshed and pushed the door open against the packed snow and walked to the house to check the damage. The house looked the way houses always look after 3 days of abandonment, in a blizzard, defeated, glazed with frost on every surface, waiting to be brought back to life. Josie worked through the recovery without urgency. She had done this before, and she would do it again, and the doing of it no longer frightened her. She restarted the stove and melted water and put on a pot of beans. Audrey came up an hour later, ran straight to the barn, and came back with her face red from the cold and a simple report: "Bess is alive. She drank all her water, but she's alive. We're fine." What Josie found on the doorstep stopped her. A business card, water-stained and nearly illegible, With a handwritten note across the back, the offer still stands. Someone had come during the storm, or just before it, and left it there. Josie picked it up. She read it once, then she carried it inside and fed it to the stove. In the brief interval between that November storm and what was coming in January, Warren Garfield came to visit. But this time he did not come to tell Josie she should leave. He came because he had seen something during the blizzard that he could not explain. From his own property looking west toward the Caldwell claim, through gaps in the driving snow, he had watched for the smoke from Josie's chimney. Every homesteader on the plains watched their neighbors smoke in a storm. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant life. The absence of smoke meant the worst. For 2 full days, Warren Garfield saw no smoke from Josie's chimney. Not a wisp, not a trace. No smoke meant no fire. No fire in those conditions meant that Josie and her daughters were dead or dying. Warren had considered going to check on them, but the wind was too severe, and Helen had physically blocked the door and told him he would not make it halfway. And then the storm broke, and Josie walked out of her house perfectly healthy, with color in her cheeks and her daughters behind her, and she fed the stove and put on a pot of beans as though nothing had happened. Warren came to her door the following day. He stood outside and looked at her and said, "How did you survive 2 days with no fire?" Josie looked at him. She did not lie. She did not tell the truth. She simply said, "I was fine, Mr. Garfield. Thank you for your concern." Warren walked home in the thin winter light, and for the first time in 2 years, he did not think that Josie Caldwell was lucky. He thought there is something I do not know, and the part that bothered him most was that he was not used to not knowing. That evening, he told Helen what he had seen. Helen suggested that perhaps Josie had burned her fire very low, too low to produce visible smoke. Warren shook his head. "No smoke means no fire," he said. Period. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then she knows something we don't." The silence between them after that was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people realize they have been wrong about someone for a long time and are not yet ready to say so out loud. What none of them knew, not Warren, not Helen, not Silas Drummond, or the Whitmores, or the merchant Fenton, or the Reverend Palmer, or the land agent Thorne sitting comfortably in a heated room in Fargo, was that the storm of November 17th was only the beginning. The winter of 1886 to 1887 arrived in earnest in January, and it did not arrive gradually. It struck the northern plains in a series of blizzards that came in rapid succession, each one lasting between 2 and 4 days, with intervals between them of barely 48 hours. Not enough time for the temperature to recover, not enough time for anyone to move supplies, not enough time for the exhausted to rest. On January 9th, the temperature at Grafton dropped to 38 degrees below zero and held there for 60 hours without meaningful interruption. The wind during the worst of that period was measured by the station agent at 47 miles per hour. Cottonwood trees split from the cold with sounds like rifle shots across the frozen prairie. The ink in Josie's pen froze solid in its inkwell inside the sod house next to the stove during the first night. A man was found frozen on the road between Grafton and the settlement at Forest River. He had been trying to walk 2 miles. He had not completed them. At the Garfield claim, a mile and a half to the east, the north wall of the wood storage shed buckled under the snow load on the night of January 9th and collapsed outward, scattering the family's cut and split firewood across an area of open yard that the blizzard immediately covered to a depth of 3 feet. Warren Garfield spent 4 hours in that storm trying to salvage what he could. Helen finally pulled him back inside when both of his feet had gone white at the toes, the patches of dead color that precedes serious frostbite. He sat by the stove with his feet in a bucket of tepid water and said nothing for a long time. By the morning of January 10th, the Garfield family had perhaps 6 hours of heating fuel left, and the outside temperature was 31 degrees below zero and steady. Helen Garfield sat down next to her husband and took his hand. "If she can't help us," she said, "we die." Warren looked at her. He knew. Helen said one more thing. "And if she can help us, then everything we've said about her for 2 years has been wrong." Warren did not answer. He stood up. He wrapped a horse blanket over his coat and tied rags around his boots. He opened the door. He walked a mile and a half in approximately 45 minutes. For the last 20 of those minutes, he could not feel his toes. He reached Josie's door and knocked. Josie opened it. She looked at him. His face was gray. His eyebrows were crusted with ice. He looked at her for a moment and then said with the specific brevity of a man who has just used most of his remaining reserves, "I need help." Josie told him to come in and get warm. Then she told him to go back and bring his family. 2 hours later, Warren Garfield and his wife Helen and their 4 children arrived at the Caldwell claim. They came at a pace that allowed for the youngest child wrapped in blankets and carried by Warren, who had made the round trip on feet he could barely feel. What they found was not the scene of desperation they might have expected. Josie had the woodshed door standing open and a rope guide rigged from the house to the entrance. She had the chamber fully prepared. The lantern was burning. The stone wall had been heated for 2 full hours. Both ventilation shafts were drawing. She had spread the second blanket on the floor and moved the hens to the far corner of the alcove. She guided them to the trapdoor. Helen went first, climbing down the rough ladder Josie had built from scrap lumber, one rung at a time, and when Helen Garfield straightened up in the warm space below ground and felt the air close around her after 3 hours of walking and freezing and carrying children through conditions that no human being should have to walk through, she did not speak. She stood in the center of the chamber for almost a full minute. She looked at the walls. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the stone mass along the western wall, radiating its stored warmth into the space like a living thing. She looked at the ventilation shaft, at the packed earth floor, at the oil lantern burning steadily above her. Then she turned to Josie, who had come down last and was pulling the trap door closed above them, and she asked the only question that made sense. "How long have you had this?" "Since October of 1884, Josie said. Helen looked at her, and in Helen's eyes, Josie saw something she had not expected. Not just gratitude, though there was that. Something else. Shame. Helen Garfield was the woman who had told Mrs. Whitmore that Josie was lucky. Helen was the woman who had sat in Reverend Palmer's meeting without speaking a word of objection. And now she was standing in the room that Josie had dug with her own hands, a room she had not known existed, a room that was about to save her family's life. "I'm sorry," Helen said quietly. Josie did not ask what for. There was no need. She simply said, "There is room for everyone." The chamber held 10 people for the first 72 hours. Josie and her 2 daughters, Warren and Helen Garfield and their 4 children, the oldest of whom was Walter, 12 years old, and the youngest a girl of 5, who had fallen asleep on her father's shoulder during the walk and had not woken up when they lowered her through the trapdoor. 10 bodies in a space built for fewer. 10 people breathing the same air, sharing the same warmth, pressed close enough together that no one could shift position without touching someone else. The lantern burned in careful shifts to conserve the remaining oil, and during the dark intervals, the only sounds were breathing and the occasional murmur of a child turning in sleep in the distant, muffled presence of the storm above them, which had not relented and which showed no sign of relenting. On the first night, nobody spoke much. They were too tired. The Garfield children huddled together near the alcove opening, and Helen sat with her back against the eastern wall holding the youngest, and Warren sat apart from everyone with his damaged feet extended in front of him, and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is in pain and has decided not to mention it. Josie managed the space the way a captain manages a ship in rough water. She rationed the cornmeal. She heated water over the lantern flame, a slow process that produced a thin, warm drink that was not coffee and was not tea, but was hot, and that was enough. She checked the ventilation twice during the first night, holding her wetted finger near the shaft opening and feeling the faint, steady pull of air moving outward, the system her father had designed working exactly as it was meant to. On the second morning, the hens in the alcove laid 2 eggs. Audrey found them. She came through the low arched opening, holding 1 egg in each hand, and her face wore an expression that everyone who was present in that chamber would remember for years afterward. It was not excitement. It was not surprise. It was the expression of a child who has just received confirmation that the world still works, that living things still produce, that even 8 feet underground in the middle of the worst storm any of them had ever experienced. A hen will do what a hen does. She held up the eggs and looked at her mother and did not need to say anything. Josie took the eggs and divided them among the youngest children, including the Garfield 5-year-old, who ate her portion without fully waking up. By the second day, the chamber had developed a rhythm. Josie managed the rationing and the ventilation checks. Helen Garfield organized the children's sleeping arrangements, rotating them through the warmest positions near the stone wall so that no one child stayed cold for too long. Silas Drummond, who had arrived on the first morning and had barely spoken since, took it upon himself to maintain the trapdoor seal, checking it twice a day without being asked, running his thick fingers along the frame edges the way Josie had taught Audrey to do. He had watched once, asked nothing, and learned. The pigs slept in the alcove with the hens and caused no trouble. The bong, a mixed breed belonging to the Whitmores, positioned itself at the foot of the trapdoor ladder and stayed there for the entire duration, as though it had appointed itself guardian of the only exit. The children, after the initial strangeness wore off, adapted faster than the adults. The Garfield 5-year-old and the youngest Whitmore child invented a game that involved rolling a dried bean across the packed earth floor and trying to stop it before it touched the wall, a game so simple and so absorbing that by the second day, 3 of the older children had joined in, and the sound of a dried bean rolling across underground earth became for everyone in that chamber the sound of normalcy, continuing in the most abnormal circumstances any of them had ever experienced. Josie noticed something during those hours that she had not anticipated. The chamber smelled different with 16 people in it. Not unpleasant exactly, but dense. The smell of wool and sweat and lamp oil and cornmeal, and the particular mineral scent of packed earth, and the warm animal smell from the alcove. It was the smell of survival at close quarters, and Josie found that she did not mind it. It was the smell of living people. After 2 winters of near silence on the claim, the presence of other human beings in the space she had built was not a burden. It was proof that the building had been worth the cost. That second day was also when the trouble started. Old Mr. Brewster had arrived with his wife on the morning of January 11th, making their way from their claim 3 miles to the northeast on a horse that was barely standing. The Brewsters were in their late 60s. Their adult son had gone to Fargo the previous autumn for work and had not returned. They had been alone on their claim for 4 months, and the January storms had reduced their firewood to nothing and their food supply to what could be measured in days. Mr. Brewster had a cough. It had started before he arrived, and it worsened in the enclosed space, a deep rattling sound that came every few minutes and echoed off the earthen walls in a way that made the chamber feel smaller than it was. By the afternoon of the second day, Mrs. Whitmore, who had arrived with her family that morning from the Garfield house, where they had been sheltering, pulled Josie aside and said in a whisper that was not nearly as quiet as she thought it was, "That old man is sick. He could have consumption for all we know. He needs to be separated from the children." Mrs. Brewster heard her. The old woman straightened up from where she had been sitting beside her husband and turned to face Mrs. Whitmore with an expression that contained 30 years of hard living and exactly 0 tolerance for nonsense. "My husband walked 3 miles in 30 below to get here," she said, "and you want to put him in a corner with the chickens." The space went tight. 16 people were in the chamber now, counting the Solbergs and the Whitmores, and a dog and a small pig that Harriet Solberg had refused to leave behind on the grounds that the pig would not survive the night in the barn, which was correct. 16 people and assorted livestock in a space that was 10 feet by 7 with a 4 by 6 alcove, and the air between Mrs. Whitmore and Mrs. Brewster had become the kind of air that precedes either an argument or a silence that is worse than an argument. Josie stepped between them. She did not raise her voice. She did not take sides. She knelt beside Mr. Brewster and listened to him breathe for a full minute, her ear close to his chest the way she had once watched a veterinarian listen to a horse. Then she stood up and said, "It is a dry cough. The air down here is dry. I will fix it." She heated water over the lantern and let the steam rise into the chamber. She positioned the small pot near Mr. Brewster so that the warm, moist air reached him directly. Within 20 minutes, the cough eased. Within an hour, it had stopped almost entirely. Mrs. Whitmore did not apologize, but she said nothing more, and in the arithmetic of close quarters, silence after conflict counts as resolution. The second conflict was quieter in volume but sharper in its edges. Walter Garfield, who was 12 and who had his father's build, and his father's habit of speaking with more certainty than his experience warranted, said something to George Whitmore, who was 11, during a dispute over who would sit closest to the stone wall. "My father found this place," Walter said. "He knew it was here. That's why we came." Audrey heard it from across the chamber. She had been sitting with Phoebe, showing her younger sister how to fold a piece of cloth into a shape that was supposed to be a rabbit, but looked more like a lump, and she went still when she heard Walter's words. She set down the cloth, she stood up. She walked across the chamber and stood in front of Walter Garfield and spoke in a voice that was calm and clear and carried no anger, only precision. "My mother dug this place," she said. 9 days, 4.5 tons of dirt. She cut the timbers and hauled them with a milk cow. She laid every stone in that wall. Your father came here because he needed help. That is not the same thing as finding it." The chamber was silent. Walter's face went red. Warren Garfield, who had been leaning against the wall with his eyes half closed, opened them and looked at his son. Then he looked at Audrey. Then he looked at Josie, who was watching from the far side of the chamber with an expression that was difficult to read, an expression that contained pride and sorrow, and something else, something that looked like the recognition that her daughter had just done a thing that Josie herself might not have done, because Josie would have let it pass and Audrey would not. Warren said to his son quietly, but with enough weight that the boy understood, "She is right. Be quiet now." It was a small moment. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it was the moment when Warren Garfield, who had spent 2 years telling himself and his neighbors that Josie Caldwell was lucky, taught his own son the lesson he had only just learned himself, that the truth does not care whether you are comfortable with it. Later that evening, when the children had settled into an uneasy sleep and the lantern was off, and the only light in the chamber was the faint gray glow from the ventilation shaft, Warren moved closer to Josie. He spoke in a voice so low that only she could hear it. "I need to tell you something," he said. Josie waited. "When Palmer held that meeting at my house, the one about you, I was there. I sat and I listened, and I did not say a word against it. Not one word. I knew it was wrong. I knew Palmer had no business deciding what you should do with your own land and your own children. But I sat there and I said nothing, because saying nothing was easier than standing up in front of my neighbors and disagreeing with a man who speaks for God." He paused. His breathing was heavy in the dark. "That is the worst kind of cowardice," he said. "The kind that looks like politeness. The kind that lets a man go home and tell himself he didn't do anything wrong because he didn't do anything at all. But not doing anything is doing something. I know that now. I should have known it then." Josie was quiet for a long time. She could feel the warmth of the stone wall against her shoulder and the weight of Phoebe sleeping against her side in the slow movement of air through the shaft above them. She thought about what Warren had said, and she thought about what it had cost him to say it, and she thought about the 2 years she had spent building and preparing and keeping her secret while this man sat in meetings about her future without speaking up. She did not say, "I forgive you." That was not how Josie spoke. Instead, she reached for the pot of cornmeal she had been warming and poured him a cup and pressed it into his hands in the dark. Warren took it. He drank. And in the silence between them, something that had been broken for 2 years was mended not with words, but with a cup of hot grain passed from one hand to another in the dark, the oldest form of peace there is. Audrey, who had been lying with her eyes closed but not sleeping, heard every word. She did not speak. But something shifted in her that night. Some hard edge that had formed when she heard about Palmer's meeting softened. Not because she had decided Warren was right, but because she had heard a grown man say, "I was a coward," out loud. And she understood at 11 years old that saying such a thing required a kind of courage that was different from the courage of digging or building or refusing to sell. It was the courage of looking at yourself clearly and not turning away from what you saw. That night, the third night underground, Josie checked the oil in the lantern, and did the calculation she had been avoiding. There was enough for approximately 4 more hours of light. If the storm continued through the following day, which the sound of the wind above suggested it would, they would spend the remaining time in complete darkness. 16 people, 6 of them children, in the dark, 8 feet below the frozen surface of the earth. The chamber would still be warm. The ventilation would still work. They would not be in danger. But darkness does things to people that cold does not. Darkness finds the places inside a person where fear lives, and it sits there and it waits. Josie made a decision. She would burn the lantern for 30 minutes every 6 hours. In the intervals, she would keep them occupied. She would keep them together. She would fill the darkness with something stronger than silence. She began to talk. She told them about her father. Not the technical details, not the drawings or the measurements, but the man himself. She told them how Willard Nesheim had built his first underground chamber in Norway when he was 19 years old, how the men in the valley had laughed at him and called him a mole, how they said he was wasting his time digging when he should have been stacking firewood and reinforcing his roof like a sensible person. She told them what happened that winter, how the cold came down so hard that the firewood ran out in 3 weeks and the roofs that had been reinforced cracked under the snow anyway. How the men who had laughed came to Willard's door one by one and asked to come inside. How he let every one of them in. How he never once said, "I told you so," because Willard Nesheim did not believe in saying things that the weather had already said for him. She told them what her father had said to her once sitting at the kitchen table with his brown paper drawings spread between them. The earth is not a hole. The earth is a house. The oldest house that human beings have ever had. In the darkness of the chamber, with the wind howling above, and 16 bodies pressed together in the warmth that the ground itself provided, Phoebe spoke. She was 9 years old now. She had not spoken much during the 3 days underground content to sit close to her mother or her sister and listen. But in the dark, after Josie finished speaking about Willard, Phoebe said in a small voice that carried clearly in the enclosed space, "Like right now, Mama." Josie reached through the dark and found her daughter's hand. "Yes," she said, "just like right now." Nobody spoke after that, but the breathing in the chamber changed. It slowed. It deepened. 16 people settled into the warmth and the dark and the quiet, and whatever fear had been gathering in the corners of the space released its grip and dissolved. On the morning of January 12th, the temperature outside rose to 8 degrees below zero, and the wind dropped to under 15 miles per hour. Not safe for extended exposure, but survivable for short distances. Silas Drummond arrived at noon on a horse he had kept alive by bringing it into his kitchen, a fact he mentioned without commentary, as though housing a horse in one's kitchen were a perfectly ordinary domestic arrangement. He had heard through whatever mechanism of frontier communication operates across even the most severe conditions that there was warmth at the Caldwell place. He did not ask questions. He did not ask how or why. He tied his horse to the woodshed post and found the trap door which Josie had stopped concealing in the emergency and climbed down. He sat on the chamber floor for 3 hours without saying a word. He was a man who had spent the winter alone on a claim where 7 of his 8 sheep had died, where the silence between storms was worse than the storms themselves because at least the storms made a sound. The presence of other human beings, warm and alive and breathing in the same space, was enough. He did not need conversation. He needed proof that the world still contained living people, and the chamber provided it. At one point during those 3 hours, the Garfield 5-year-old walked over to Silas and placed a dried bean in his hand. It was the bean from the rolling game. Silas looked at the bean, looked at the child, and closed his fist around it. He kept it in his coat pocket for the rest of the winter. He never told anyone why. The only thing he said before climbing out at the end of his 3 hours was addressed to no one in particular. "It is warmer down here than any house I have slept in this winter." The Whitmore family arrived the following morning. Then the Solbergs from 2 miles south, Harriet walking with a cane she had not needed the previous year and carrying the small pig in a canvas sack slung over her shoulder. Then the elderly Brewsters. 2 more families came in the days that followed. At its peak, the chamber and the alcove together sheltered 16 people and at various times a dog, 4 hens, and 1 pig. Harriet Solberg climbed down through the trap door, stood in the center of the chamber, and looked around at the stone wall, the ventilation shafts, the timber ceiling, the packed earth floor. She looked at Josie, who was standing by the alcove opening with a cup of warm water in her hand. "Your father built one hell of a builder," Harriet said. Josie shook her head. "My father drew the plans. I built it." Harriet smiled. It was the first time anyone had smiled in weeks. "That is exactly right," she said. "I am talking to the builder." The temperature held. The ventilation held. The stone wall, which had been doing its slow, patient work since October of 1884, held. And when the worst of the January storms finally broke, and the temperatures began their grudging retreat toward zero, and above the story of what Josie Caldwell had built under her woodshed moved through the small community of Pembina County in the way that genuinely useful knowledge always moves when people have recently been frightened. Quickly, precisely, and with a specific weight of something that will not be forgotten. Warren Garfield, before he led his family home, stood at the door of the woodshed and turned back to Josie. He did not thank her, though he would later many times. Instead, he asked a question. "Will you teach me to build one?" Josie said, "I will teach you." There was no handshake, no grand statement, just two people standing in the cold agreeing on a practical thing. Then Warren looked at her once more and said, "Your father, Willard. What kind of man was he?" Josie thought about it. "He was the kind of man who built before anyone believed it was necessary," she said. "Like me." Warren nodded slowly. "Like you," he said. It was the first time he had acknowledged it directly. Not that she had survived, not that she had been lucky, but that she had built something deliberately and with skill, and that the building had saved his family's life. And Josie, who had spent 2 years waiting for someone other than Audrey and Harriet to see what she had done, found that the acknowledgement, when it finally came, did not feel the way she had expected. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like the end of a long silence, the moment when a conversation that should have happened 2 years ago finally begins. Warren nodded slowly. "Like you," he said. It was the first time he had acknowledged it directly. Not that she had survived. Not that she had been lucky, but that she had built something deliberately and with skill, and that the building had saved his family's life. In late January, when the worst had passed, but the cold had not yet loosened its grip, Franklin Thorne returned to Grafton. He went to Fenton's store expecting the same quiet cooperation he had received in October. What he found instead was a merchant who would not meet his eyes. Fenton had heard the story, not from Josie, from Pratt, the station agent, who kept a daily journal and who had pieced together from the mail carriers and the few travelers who passed through during the thaw what had happened at the Caldwell claim. 16 people sheltered underground. A structure built by a widow with no assistance. Warmth maintained through 60 hours of temperatures that had killed livestock and frozen men on open roads. Fenton was not a sentimental man. He was a merchant. But he was also a man who lived in Grafton and depended on the goodwill of the people who bought their flour and nails and lamp oil from his shelves. If word got out that he had helped a land speculator buy the property of the woman who had just saved half the homesteaders in the county, he would lose customers he could not afford to lose. "I don't think Mrs. Caldwell is interested in selling," Fenton told Thorne, "and I think you should ask her yourself." Thorne went to the Caldwell claim. When he arrived, he found that Josie was not alone. Warren Garfield was there replacing the cracked window glass with a pane he had brought from his own supply. Silas Drummond was there splitting wood by the south wall of the house with the silent efficiency of a man who considers physical labor a form of conversation. Thorne looked at the two men. He looked at Josie, who was standing by the door with a hammer in her hand, having been working on the woodshed roof. He read the situation with the quick eye of a man who buys and sells property for a living and who knows when a deal is dead. "I withdraw my offer," he said. "Good luck to you." He mounted his horse and rode back toward Grafton. Josie watched him go. She did not say anything. She turned back to the roof and drove the next nail. In March of 1887, Warren Garfield stood in the Grafton feed store and described the underground chamber to a group of men who had gathered around the stove. He called it the most practical piece of building he had ever seen in his life, and he announced that he intended to build one on his own claim before the following autumn. He did. The station agent Pratt, a meticulous man who kept a daily journal of weather conditions and local events, wrote a 4-paragraph count of Josephine Caldwell's underground shelter in his journal entry for February 22nd, 1887. He noted that it had provided warmth and safety for no fewer than 16 persons during the extreme conditions of January, and that it had been designed and constructed by a widow of 33 years, operating alone without assistance and without any apparent recognition of the difficulty of what she had undertaken. That journal survived. It is held today in the collections of the State Historical Society of North Dakota, cataloged under the general heading of Frontier Homesteader Accounts, in a box that also contains a seed catalog from 1889, a child's drawing of a horse in 3 letters in Norwegian that have never been translated. Josephine Caldwell paid off the remaining $48 of her debt to Fenton by the autumn of 1887. Part of the money came from the sale of 2 calves she had raised from Bess. Part of it came from a modest sum Warren Garfield paid her for designing and supervising the construction of his own underground shelter. On the day she made the final payment, Fenton wrote out a receipt and handed it to her across the counter. Josie took it, folded it carefully, and put it in her coat pocket. She walked out of the store and onto the main street of Grafton. Reverend Cyrus Palmer was walking toward her on the opposite side of the street. They saw each other. Palmer stopped. Josie stopped. They stood perhaps 20 feet apart, and for a moment neither of them moved. Palmer opened his mouth. He was going to say something. Perhaps an apology, perhaps a word of congratulation, perhaps an explanation of why he had done what he had done, the letters and the meetings and the quiet campaign to convince a woman that she could not do what she had already done. Josie did not wait to find out. She gave him a nod, a small, polite, precise nod, exactly the kind of nod he had given her the first time he left her house 2 years earlier, the nod of a person who has said everything they intend to say. Then she turned and walked to the wagon and drove home. She did not need his apology. She needed to repair the woodshed roof before September. Harriet Solberg died in the spring of 1888 quietly in her sleep. Josie found her. She had walked over to Harriet's claim because Harriet had not come to collect her eggs at the usual time, and Harriet was a woman of such fixed routine that a deviation of even an hour meant something was wrong. The door was unlatched. The cabin was cold. Harriet lay on her bed with the quilt pulled to her chin and her hands folded on top of it, the fingers interlaced with the deliberate neatness of someone who had arranged them herself before closing her eyes. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of pain. Josie thought the way a person looks when they have finished their work and have decided to rest. Josie sat beside the bed for a long time before she went to tell anyone. She did not cry, though she would later, alone, standing in the barn with her forehead against the warm flank of Bess, the only place she allowed herself that kind of privacy. What she felt sitting beside Harriet was not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular emptiness that comes when the one person who understood you, without requiring an explanation, is no longer there to understand. Harriet had never asked Josie how the chamber worked. She had never asked for the drawings or the measurements or the principles behind the design. She had simply looked at Josie and known the way one working woman recognizes another, that whatever Josie was building, she was building it well. That recognition, offered without conditions and without the need for proof, had sustained Josie through 2 years of silence and doubt more than any engineering principle ever could. Josie buried her on the Caldwell claim next to Samuel. Not because Harriet was family by blood, but because on the northern plains, family was not defined by blood. It was defined by who stood with you when standing was the hardest thing to do. Harriet had stood. She had walked 2 miles through spring mud to warn Josie about a meeting held behind her back. She had carried a pig in a sack through a blizzard rather than let it die alone. She had looked at Josie and said, "I am talking to the builder," and she had meant it, and she had been the first person besides Audrey to say it. When Josie finished filling the grave, she stood at the edge of it and placed her hand flat on the mounded earth, the same way she had once placed her hand on the floor of the chamber, in the dark feeling for warmth. The ground was cold. It was April, and the frost had not fully released its hold on the upper soil. But Josie kept her hand there for a long moment anyway, because the gesture meant something to her that she could not have explained to anyone who had not built what she had built. Josie Caldwell did not leave the claim. She continued to work it for the next 22 years. She expanded her acreage. She raised cattle. She repaired the woodshed roof that Samuel had never finished, and she repaired it again when the wind took it. And again after that, because on the northern plains, the work does not end, and the woman who does it does not ask for it to end. She asks only for the strength to continue and the ground to hold. Audrey Caldwell, who was 11 during the hard winter, learned everything her mother knew about underground construction. She did not learn it from the drawings alone. She learned it from digging, from hauling, from pressing her hands against stone and feeling the warmth stored inside. She taught the method to two other women in the community before her own marriage in 1897. When Audrey married her husband, a quiet and practical man named Lund asked her one question about the underground chamber she wanted to build on their new claim. "How deep?" "8 feet, Audrey said. "When do we start?" "Now." He did not ask why. He did not ask whether it was necessary. He picked up a spade and followed her to the spot she had already chosen, and they began to dig, and the sound of the blade hitting earth was for Audrey, the sound of everything her mother had taught her, continuing forward into a life she had built for herself. Phoebe Caldwell, the younger daughter, the child who had cried for 40 minutes the first night she ever spent underground, and then slept on the warm earth without waking, grew up to become a school teacher in the town of Park River, 20 miles north of the old claim. She was a good teacher, patient, thorough, not given to drama or exaggeration. But on particularly cold January days, when the wind came down from the north, and the schoolhouse stove struggled to hold the room, and the children shifted in their seats and pulled their coats tighter around their shoulders, Phoebe Caldwell would set down her chalk and lean against the edge of her desk and tell them a story. She told them about a winter when the temperature held at 38 below zero for 3 days. She told them about a woman who had dug a room under a woodshed with nothing but a spade and a set of drawings on brown paper and the knowledge her father had given her. She told them about 16 people who had nowhere else to go and who went underground into the earth and found warmth there when every other source of warmth had failed. She always paused before the end. She looked at her students, their young faces, their cold hands, their breath visible in the struggling air of the schoolhouse. And she said, "I was 7 years old the first night I went down into that chamber. I cried for 40 minutes. I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid the earth would press down on me and I would not be able to breathe." Then she smiled, and then I slept for 11 hours. Because the earth did not press down, the earth held me up. She always finished the story the same way, not with numbers, not with engineering, not with the dimensions of the chamber, or the temperature readings, or the number of people it sheltered. She finished with a single detail that she said had stayed with her for 60 years, through everything that followed through her own marriage and her own children, and the slow softening of the years into memory. The image of an oil lantern burning in a chamber 8 feet below the floor of a forgotten woodshed on the northern plains. 16 people sitting in its light, people who had been strangers and skeptics and doubters, people who had called her mother lucky people, who had met in rooms to discuss whether she should be allowed to keep her own land. All of them together now underground, warm, alive, because one woman had known something they did not and had built accordingly and had opened the door when they came. And the flame of that lantern did not flicker, not once, not even when the worst of it came. Because the earth, if you are willing to go deep enough, does not shake. And a woman who knows that and who builds on that knowledge and who teaches her daughters to build on it after her does not need permission from the cold.